We hear it all the time, right? That church and money just don't mix, like oil and water or something. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? What if there's actually like a ton of wisdom in the Bible about how we should think about our economic lives?
It's a huge question. And it's not just theoretical either. Throughout history, different economic systems have tried to, claim the Bible supports their way of doing things. So understanding what the Bible really teaches about economics is super important, not just what we think it says, because it affects, well, everything really, how we live, how our society functions, all of that.
It's like the foundation for so much. So think of this deep dive as a crash course. We've gone through a lot of fascinating material to try to extract the key economic principles from the Bible. We want to make it clear, engaging, even insightful, so you can think about your material well-being and your spiritual life too in a deeper way.
We've broken it down into 7 big areas. Let's start with the basics. Private property. That idea of, do we have a right to own things? To manage resources? What does the Bible say about all that?
And from there, we'll get into the idea of equity, but equity in a biblical sense. Like, what does fairness and justice really mean? And how should that shape how we interact with each other when it comes to money and resources?
Then we'll look at the whole idea of industry, of hard work, and how the Bible views that. What's the value of labor? The purpose behind it.
Compassion is obviously a huge part of the Bible's message, so we'll be exploring our responsibility to those in need, to the poor. What does that look like?
After that, we'll shift gears a bit and look at some of the potential pitfalls of systems like socialism and communism. Why is it that, from a biblical perspective and historically, those approaches haven't always been successful?
But then, to balance it out, we'll also look at the power of capitalistic principles. How do they align potentially with what the Bible teaches? And why has free enterprise been such a powerful force, at least in some ways?
And to wrap it all up, we'll discuss why Christian ethics are so important, especially when it comes to economics. Because a just and flourishing economy, well, that really needs a solid ethical foundation, right?
Absolutely. Okay, let's start with that foundation then. Private property, it seems pretty clear that the Bible says God owns everything, right? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. But at the same time, it seems like it places a lot of emphasis on individual ownership as well. How do those two things go together?
Yeah, that's a key distinction to understand. I mean, just look at the 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet. Those commandments imply that individuals have a legitimate claim to stuff,
Yeah.
to their possessions. If everything belonged to everyone, well, those commands wouldn't really mean anything, would they?
Right, there'd be nothing to steal, nothing to covet. It assumes there's a system of personal property rights in place. Okay, so what are the practical benefits then when we really grasp this idea of private property? Not just this is mine, but on a deeper level.
Well, one of the biggest benefits is it really boosts productivity. When people know that they're going to directly benefit from their hard work, from the resources they manage, well, they're just way more motivated, right?
Yeah.
To be productive, to innovate, to make things better. I mean, why bother putting in all that effort to improve something if someone can just come along and take it?
Yeah. It's like the difference between taking care of your own garden, making it perfect, versus just kind of like half-heartedly weeding a little patch in a field where everyone's sharing the harvest no matter how much work they put in.
Exactly. And it also develops a sense of, personal responsibility. When you own something, you take care of it.
Right.
You manage it wisely. You're accountable for its upkeep and for how you use it. This applies to material stuff, of course, but it also applies to, like, our talents, the opportunities we have. We have to manage those well, too.
It creates a sense of ownership on like a deeper level. And it seems like this respect for private property, it kind of lays the foundation for greater economic freedom as well.
Absolutely. It gives people a level of independence.
Yeah.
They're not completely reliant on, the government or some collective for everything. It encourages individual initiative, that entrepreneurial spirit. And those are the things that really drive a dynamic economy.
So what happens when this principle is ignored or not really understood? What kind of negative consequences do we see?
Well, all those benefits we just talked about, they start to disappear. When people feel like their property rights aren't secure, that they could be violated, they just aren't as motivated to work hard, to invest for the future. History is full of examples, where societies that disregarded private property, they ended up with stagnant economies. Because why bother innovating if you can't be sure you'll benefit?
And it goes beyond economics too, doesn't it? Like socially?
Oh, absolutely. When you don't respect property rights, you see more conflict, more disputes over resources, more theft. It can even lead to social unrest. And as our source material points out, it often leads to government overreach, which, they argue is the worst way to try to fix a country's economic problems.
Okay, let's bring it home now. Here in the USA, how do we see this principle of private property playing out? What are some of the ways people act that demonstrate they understand it?
Well, one of the most basic ways is through investing and building wealth. Buying a house, investing in businesses, saving for retirement, all of those things assume that you have a right to own those assets, to control them,
Yeah.
and to benefit from them.
Right. And we have this strong entrepreneurial culture here, too.
Exactly. People starting businesses,
Yeah.
putting their own money on the line, taking those risks, because they know that if they succeed, the rewards are theirs. That ownership is a huge motivator. And then you have all the legal protections around intellectual property, patents, copyrights, trademarks. Those recognize the ownership of ideas, and that encourages people to keep innovating.
Thinking about other systems then, ones that maybe don't emphasize this principle as much, what are some of the mistakes we see?
Well, often it's too much government control. When the state owns or heavily regulates everything, it often just doesn't work as well. It's less efficient, less responsive to what people actually need. The Soviet Union is a good example, before the reforms. And communist China, too, before they started opening up their economy.
Right. Less personal stake, less efficiency. It kind of makes sense.
Totally. Another issue is just a lack of secure property rights.
Hmm.
If people aren't confident that what they own is truly theirs, they aren't going to invest. They won't build things because it could be taken away. And of course, corruption, theft, those are huge problems. They discourage people from working hard, from being productive.
So what's the takeaway for our listener then? How can they apply this idea of private property to their own lives?
It starts with a mindset, a mindset of ownership, not just of your stuff, but also your skills, your talents, your time. Those are all valuable. Manage them well, develop them, be productive. And respect the property of others, of course, both the physical stuff and their ideas, their work. Think of it like, God entrusted the garden to Adam. You've been given resources to manage. It's a stewardship. Do it wisely, ethically, with consideration for others.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to our next principle. Equity. Fairness.
Hmm.
But fairness, like biblically speaking, our source material says this is more than just everyone getting the same amount of stuff.
Oh, yeah, definitely. In the Bible, when it talks about equity, it's about uprightness, justice, integrity, a level playing field. Our source goes so far as to say that biblically, equity might be the most central economic principle, second only to compassion.
Interesting. So equity. But our source is really careful to distinguish between equity and equality. And I think that's where some other economic theories might diverge from a biblical perspective.
Right. Some approaches, like socialism, they often focus on equality of outcome, everyone ending up with the same amount. But biblical equity recognizes that, well, we live in a fallen world. There are going to be differences in wealth, in resources. People make different choices. They have different skills. They're not all equally diligent. It's not about forcing everyone to have the same result. It's about making sure everyone has a fair chance and is treated justly.
So what are the benefits of striving for this kind of biblical equity?
Well, for one, it creates a more harmonious society, more just, less exploitation, less unfair treatment. It builds trust, which is really important in any economic system. If you know you're going to be treated fairly, you're more likely to trade, to invest, to do business, and it creates accountability too.
Right.
Those who work hard, they're rewarded. Those who are lazy, well, they face the consequences. It's fair.
Okay. What about the flip side? What happens when we don't have this equity?
It's the opposite of all that, really. You get exploitation, strong taking advantage of the weak. The prophets in the Bible, they were always railing against that. You get a breakdown of trust, more corruption, and a lot of resentment and division. When people think the system is rigged against them, it leads to problems.
It makes sense. So how do we see this principle of equity being applied here in the USA, within our laws, our economic systems?
Well, we see it in laws and regulations that try to create a fair playing field. Antitrust laws to prevent monopolies. Rules against insider trading in the stock market. Those are all about making sure things are fair. We also try to promote equal opportunity, making sure everyone has access to education, to jobs, to the resources they need to succeed. And a lot of people, a lot of businesses, they really try to act with honesty and integrity, paying fair prices, treating employees well.
And what about the places where we see other systems falling short when it comes to this biblical idea of equity?
Sadly, you see a lot of exploitation. Really low wages, unsafe working conditions, unfair contracts. You see businesses using deceptive practices, misleading advertising, scams, price gouging. And in a lot of places, it's all about who you know, not what you know. Favoritism, cronyism, that creates a really unfair system.
Right. So how can our listener apply this principle of equity to their own lives?
I think it comes down to just trying to be fair. In all your interactions, treat everyone with respect. Don't try to take advantage of anyone. Be honest in your work and your business dealings. If you see injustice, speak out against it. Even in your own personal judgments, try to be fair and impartial. Because God cares about justice. He cares about equity. And when we live that way, it makes a difference.
It does. Okay, we've talked about ownership. We've talked about fairness. Now let's get into another big one, hard work, what the Bible calls the dignity of industry.
Yeah. This is a theme that runs throughout the Bible. It has a really positive view of work. It calls us to be industrious, to be productive. And it says that work has inherent worth. Work has purpose. And this isn't just some afterthought, like something that came after the fall. Because even before the fall, God placed Adam in the garden to cultivate it, to care for it.
Right, so work itself wasn't the curse.
Exactly. And the Bible links our work to our right to own what we produce. If you look at the Old Testament laws, there's a lot of emphasis on honesty in business, in the marketplace. It all points to the value of honest, hard work.
So what are the benefits of this work ethic, personally and for society as a whole?
Well, the most obvious one is productivity. When people work hard, they produce more goods, more services. That's how you build a strong economy. And it improves everyone's standard of living. But it's not just about stuff. Work also gives us a sense of purpose, a sense of accomplishment. We're using our talents, we're contributing to something, and it helps us avoid poverty, helps us provide for ourselves and our families.
Okay, what about when we don't work hard? What are the consequences of laziness?
The Bible doesn't mince words on this one. Laziness leads to poverty, to scarcity, to dependence on others. And the Bible doesn't have a lot of sympathy for people who are poor just because they don't want to work. And on a personal level, laziness can lead to dissatisfaction, boredom. You're not growing, you're not achieving anything.
And how do we see this principle, the dignity of industry, playing out here in the USA?
I mean, look at all the entrepreneurs we have. People working crazy hours to build their businesses. We put a lot of emphasis on education, on developing skills, because that makes people more productive. And we admire people who are dedicated to their work, who are persistent, who strive for excellence.
And what about the flip side? Where do we see this principle falling short?
Sometimes there's a sense of entitlement, people expecting to be provided for without putting in the work. You see procrastination, a lacking initiative, people waiting for things to happen instead of making them happen. And it leads to poor quality work. People just not caring as much, not taking pride in what they do.
So how can our listener apply this principle to their own lives?
I think it's about cultivating a strong work ethic.
Yeah.
In every area of your life, not just your job. Be diligent in your responsibilities. Take initiative. Don't wait for someone to tell you what to do. Be persistent. Work through challenges. Strive for excellence. Remember that work is an opportunity, to honor God, to use your gifts, to serve others. It's not just about a paycheck.
That's a great way to look at it. Okay, let's move on to another essential piece of biblical economics, compassion, that call to show mercy.
This is really important because while the Bible emphasizes hard work, responsibility, all those things, it also has a deep concern for the poor, for the vulnerable, for those who are struggling. God himself is described as having compassion for those in need over and over again.
Right, and the Old Testament law, it even had specific provisions for the poor, like leaving gleanings in the field for them to gather.
Exactly. And Jesus, his teachings and actions, they constantly emphasize compassion, practical acts of mercy.
It's interesting, though, because our source makes a distinction between different categories of the poor, right? It's more nuanced than just saying everyone who's poor deserves help.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The source says there are different reasons why people are poor. Some are poor because of their own choices. They're lazy. They make bad decisions. The Bible holds them accountable for that to some degree. Others are poor because of things beyond their control. Catastrophes, disasters, just bad luck. They deserve our compassion and our help. And then there are those who are poor because they're being exploited. They're being taken advantage of. They need our compassion, but they also need us to fight for justice for them. And then there are those who choose a simpler lifestyle, who might not have a lot of possessions, but are content with what they have. We have to recognize those differences and respond appropriately.
So what are the benefits of embracing this mandate of compassion?
First of all, it reflects God's character. When we show mercy to others, we're imitating him. We're showing his love to the world. And we're meeting real needs. We're helping people who are hurting, who are struggling. And that builds stronger communities. It creates a more caring, more supportive society for everyone.
What about the flip side? What happens when we don't show compassion?
We're ignoring a very clear biblical command. We're turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. And that allows injustice to continue. And on a personal level, it hardens our hearts. We become less empathetic, less connected to God's love.
So how do we see this principle of compassion being lived out here in the USA?
Oh, in so many ways. People giving to charities, volunteering their time, churches and nonprofits providing food, shelter, healthcare to those who need it, people advocating for policies that protect the vulnerable.
And where do we see people falling short?
Sometimes it's just pure selfishness. People focused on making money, getting ahead, without any thought for those who are struggling. Sometimes it's blaming the poor for their situation without offering any help, or recognizing that there might be systemic issues at play.
So what's the challenge for our listener? How can they be more compassionate?
I think it starts with cultivating a compassionate heart, being sensitive to the needs of others, looking for opportunities to show mercy, to offer help. It might be giving money, it might be volunteering, it might just be a kind word, a listening ear. But be generous, be willing to help, especially those who are truly in need, because our success isn't just about how much we accumulate for ourselves. It's about how we use what we have to bless others.
That's a good word. Okay, let's get into some potentially controversial territory now. Our source material is pretty critical of socialist and communist systems.
Yeah, it is. It doesn't hold back. It basically says that those systems historically have failed. It points to examples like East and West Germany, the stark difference in their economies, or the fact that Russia, after the revolution, had to start importing grain even though they used to be a major exporter. They say these are examples of fundamental flaws in those systems.
And what are some of those flaws, according to the source?
One thing they point out is the confusion between equity and equality. We talk about biblical equity. But these other systems, they often try to force equality of outcome. Everyone gets the same, regardless of effort. And the source says that often backfires. It disincentivizes people from working hard, from being productive. And they often blame poverty solely on exploitation by other countries or the wealthy, which might be part of the problem, but it's not the whole story.
And the source doesn't shy away from the human rights issues either, right?
No, not at all. They talk about the brutal regimes, the mass killings under Stalin, under Mao Zedong, the suppression of individual freedom that often goes hand in hand with these types of systems. It's a serious critique.
So what's the benefit of understanding these potential pitfalls?
Well, it helps us be more discerning about the policies we support, about the economic systems we advocate for. We have to learn from history, right? And be aware of the potential consequences. And it helps us to be more realistic about the causes of poverty, to look for solutions that actually work, not just ones that sound good in theory.
And what happens if we ignore these lessons? What are the risks?
We could end up repeating those same mistakes. We could see our economy decline, shortages, a lower standard of living. We could see the government getting more and more control over our lives. And we could even see a rise in authoritarianism, a loss of freedom. It's happened before.
It's a sobering thought. So how do we see people in the USA who understand these risks responding? What are they doing?
You see a lot of support for free market principles, for limited government intervention in the economy. The idea is that those things allow for more innovation, more productivity, more prosperity overall, while also protecting individual freedom. There's also a lot of pushback against policies that are seen as too socialist, too communist. People are concerned about the impact on the economy and on their freedom. And you see people trying to educate others about the history of these systems, the good and the bad.
What about those who do support those systems? What mistakes are they making?
Sometimes it's just a lack of awareness of history, or a willingness to look at the facts objectively. Sometimes it's blaming all the world's problems on capitalism without considering other factors, or the flaws in the systems they're proposing. And I think often there's a failure to understand the importance of incentives, of competition, of secure property rights. Those things are essential for a thriving economy.
Okay. So what's the takeaway for our listener? How can they apply this understanding of history to their own lives?
Be informed. Be critical. Don't just accept what you hear at face value. Look at the evidence. Look at the track record of different economic systems. Appreciate the benefits of economic freedom. And understand that real sustainable prosperity, it usually comes from hard work, from individual initiative, from wise stewardship of resources, not from top-down control.
Great advice. Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about capitalism, or, as our source puts it, free enterprise.
Yeah, the source has a generally positive view of capitalism, but with some important caveats, which we'll get to. It says that when capitalism is done right, ethically, it's the best system for creating wealth, boosting productivity, and raising the standard of living for most people. And it identifies 4 key principles: production, tools, capital, and profit.
Okay, break those down for us.
Sure, production is the most basic one. You have to produce things, right? Goods, services. The more you produce, the more there's to go around. Prices go down, more jobs are created. But to really increase production, you need tools. And by tools, they mean anything that helps us be more productive. Technology, knowledge, infrastructure, all that. But to get those tools, you need capital, which is basically saved resources, usually money, that you can invest. And the incentive for all of this is profit. The idea that if you work hard, if you invest wisely, you can make a profit.
Right.
And that profit allows you to create more, to invest more.
So how do all these things work together in a free market?
The key is the division of labor. People specialize in what they're good at, and then they trade with each other. Everyone benefits. It's more efficient, it leads to more innovation, and everyone has access to a wider variety of goods and services.
So when these principles are working well, what do we see?
We see wealth creation, people's standard of living goes up, more jobs are created,
Right.
prices go down because there's more competition, everyone benefits.
What happens when we ignore these principles?
The opposite, basically. The economy stagnates. There are shortages, people are worse off. When you discourage profit, you discourage investment, you discourage innovation, and that hurts everyone.
So how does all of this play out here in the USA? How do we see these principles at work?
Well, look at the stock market. People investing in companies hoping to make a profit, that's fueling economic growth. Or people starting businesses, taking risks, using capital, trying to create something new and profitable, even just saving money, investing it wisely. That's all based on these principles.
And what about other systems? What mistakes do we see them making?
Sometimes it's too much government interference. Taxes that are too high, regulations that are too burdensome. That discourages investment. It stifles innovation. Sometimes it's policies that make it hard to start a business, or a culture that doesn't value entrepreneurship. And sometimes it's just a misunderstanding of the role of profit. People demonize profit, but it's the engine that drives a healthy economy.
So for our listener, how can they benefit from understanding these principles?
Think about how you create value. What are your skills, your talents? How can you use your resources, even if it's just a little bit of savings, to build something, to create something? Look for opportunities to exchange value with others. That's how we all benefit. Invest in yourself. Learn new skills. Acquire new knowledge. Manage your money well so you can have capital to invest. And collaborate with others. Work together, specialize. Everyone brings something to the table.
Great advice. Okay, let's get to our final principle. And this seems to be the key to making all the others work. The need for Christian ethics in economics. It sounds like our source believes that capitalism on its own can be a bit of a wild animal.
That's a great way to put it. The source says that while capitalism can create wealth, it can also lead to some really negative outcomes if it's not guided by strong ethics, specifically Christian ethics.
So how should our faith shape our approach to economics? To money?
It all starts with recognizing that we're fallen. We're naturally selfish, greedy, and capitalism, it can amplify those tendencies if we're not careful. But the gospel, it transforms us. It teaches us to be selfless, to be generous, to care for others. And when those values guide our economic decisions, it changes everything.
What are some of those core Christian values that are so important in this context?
Stewardship is a big one.
Mhm.
We're not the ultimate owners of anything. God is. We're just managing his resources. And we have to do it wisely, responsibly. Honesty is crucial. Integrity in all our dealings and all our business practices. Justice, making sure everyone is treated fairly. And of course, compassion, caring for those in need.
So what happens when we integrate those values into capitalism? What does it look like?
Well, you see less greed, less exploitation. You see more generosity, more social responsibility, and you see more trust, more integrity in the marketplace. It creates a healthier environment for everyone.
And what about when those values are absent?
That's when you see the worst of capitalism, the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Exploitation of workers, consumers, the environment. It becomes all about profit, no matter the cost.
So how are Christians in the USA trying to live this out?
You see it in Christian business owners who run their businesses ethically, who treat their employees well, who give generously to those in need. You see it in people advocating for policies that promote justice and compassion.
And where do we see people falling short?
When businesses cut corners, engage in unethical practices just to make more money, when they mistreat their employees, when they ignore the impact of their actions on the environment, on society.
So how can our listeners apply these Christian ethics to their own lives?
It's about integrating your faith with your finances, with every economic decision you make. Let biblical principles be your guide. Love, justice, honesty, compassion, stewardship. Those things should shape how you work, how you spend, how you save, how you invest, how you give. Remember that you're a steward. Use what you've been given wisely for God's glory, for the good of others. Because true success isn't just about how much you accumulate, it's about how you use it to make a difference.
That's a great way to wrap things up. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into biblical economics.
It's been my pleasure. It's an important topic.
We hope you found this conversation helpful. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's always more to explore. So if this has sparked your interest, we encourage you to keep digging, keep learning, keep wrestling with these ideas and how they apply to your own life.
Because true wealth, true well-being, it's about more than just money. It's about aligning our lives with God's principles in every area, including our finances.
And that's something worth thinking about. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive. We hear it all the time, right? That church and money just don't mix, like oil and water or something. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? What if there's actually like a ton of wisdom in the Bible about how we should think about our economic lives?
It's a huge question. And it's not just theoretical either. Throughout history, different economic systems have tried to, claim the Bible supports their way of doing things. So understanding what the Bible really teaches about economics is super important, not just what we think it says, because it affects, well, everything really, how we live, how our society functions, all of that.
It's like the foundation for so much. So think of this deep dive as a crash course. We've gone through a lot of fascinating material to try to extract the key economic principles from the Bible. We want to make it clear, engaging, even insightful, so you can think about your material well-being and your spiritual life too in a deeper way.
We've broken it down into 7 big areas. We'll start with the basics. Private property. That idea of, do we have a right to own things? To manage resources. What does the Bible say about all that?
And from there, we'll get into the idea of equity. But equity in a biblical sense. Like, what does fairness and justice really mean? And how should that shape how we interact with each other when it comes to money and resources?
Then we'll look at the whole idea of industry.